welcome to another episode of 177 Nations of Tasmania. In this episode, I'm talking with Khaled, who was born and bred in Yemen. It's a country we might hear about in passing on the news, and that news is usually bad news, as it's been plagued by chaos and misfortune for many years. Now, to give a little context for Khaled's story, in 2011, the government of Yemen was overthrown by a group known as the Houthis. The government continued in exile in Saudi Arabia, and in 2015, Saudi Arabia led a coalition of countries in the region to bomb Yemen, and they bombed Yemen big. And so it's no coincidence that in 2015, Khaled's parents decided it would be better for him to live and study overseas. And as fate would have it, he would end up studying business and finance at the University of Tasmania. And since he's been here, Khaled has really made the most of his opportunities in Tasmania. And even though he graduated just as the COVID pandemic hit, and he spent 2 years struggling to find work in very difficult circumstances. But in that time, he wrote a novel, joined a soccer club, and developed his love of music. And eventually someone took a chance on him, and he now works as a policy analyst in the Tasmanian government. Nevertheless, instability and violence are still an ever-present threat in his homeland, and the fear for the safety of family members is still there.
I was born in a city in Yemen called Ib, which is in the northern part of Yemen, and it's a very mountainy place. And my family used to own a very small hospital in that town, and that's where I was born. But I only lived there for 4 years or 3 years before we moved to the capital. And so most of my life in Yemen, I lived in the capital before I left in 2015. And it was just a normal Arab city in the Middle East, basically. We grew up with lots of football. I played football almost every day in the streets and fields, wherever it was. Even sometimes in the living rooms with my cousins, we would just create this atmosphere and bring in even some fans from outside. Little kids who used to be in the neighborhood will just take them into the living room and then just create our own atmospheres and play a World Cup final or whatever it is. And I grew up a lot with my cousins and with my family, just because that's how it used to be set. If you have cousins on your age, you hang out with them, and then on school you have your own circles as well, your own friends. But there was a lot of instability, a lot of safety concerns all the time. But my parents did a great job on preparing us to almost everything. And because my family used to live in good neighborhoods, so it was less of a problem. But we would go to neighborhoods of family members who used to live in gang areas and very unstable areas. But even then, it used to be fine. People in the hardest locations, people know how to survive even better in the safest locations, because you have that sense of awareness all the time, and people know where to go, what time, who to be friends with, and who to leave aside. And so I never really faced any major issues growing up until the war actually started. Well, there were so many wars, and the beginning of instability happened in 2011 when the revolution happened. But I was quite young at the time, around 11 or 12 years old. But I could notice the shift in behavior of the community, the increase in poverty and instability in the country. And from 2011 until 2015, and that's when I left, I saw a huge difference in the way I used to live and the way I lived after the revolution. And that span of 4 years to 5 years between the revolution and the airstrikes that happened in the capital from the Saudi coalition, yeah, it used to be much more dangerous, especially the last year. And we can talk more about it moving forward. But especially that last year, it was one of the main reasons my father decided to leave the country and to find better opportunities for his kids, basically.
And so you mentioned your parents sort of preparing you to know how to be safe. So what kind of things did they tell you or teach you to do?
I think it was less of direct teaching in a way, but putting us in the best schools, putting us in the best circles, teaching us about ethics, morality, in a way of showing us. My father used to take me with him to the clinic. My mother did the same as well. And I would see how they would talk to people. And then on weekends, I would see who they're friends with. And they would talk to me about certain friends that I had and why I shouldn't hang out with them. But they never forced me to not hang out with anyone. And I quite honestly went against their advice so many times, only to understand why they were right. But they understood that for me to understand it, maybe I should live it. And
Okay.
I had so many horrible friendships. I had so many great friendships, but they kind of let me discover my own way, giving me enough support to, all right, if you're entering a dangerous territory, that's where we're going to stop you forcibly. It never came out to that, but I just learned so much from them putting me on all the right places for me to have a supporting environment to learn in a way. So I used to always study in the best schools. I used to be around the best places. I used to hang out with my father and his friends and listen to their experiences. And then sometimes I'd get a scolding here and there about certain stuff I did, especially in school. I used to be a very nasty kid in school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I remember once my dad came to school and they told him that I was the head of the gang in the school.
Right.
And that was a pivotal moment for him. And that day it had to be a verbal teaching, a very strong verbal teaching opportunity. And I changed from it as well. But they always prepared us in that way to understand what's good and what's bad. But not only to just verbally tell us what it is, but most importantly to show us through their livings. They used to take us everywhere. Even my sisters, they would take them to their friends' gatherings. They would take them into circles where we understood nothing about what they were talking about. Politics, ethics, philosophy, whatever it is.
What does your father do?
Well, my father is a cardiologist and my mother is a doctor as well. She's an obstetrician, so for females and pregnancy and whatnot. So they're both quite educated and very successful in their careers, one of the best in the country, and they worked super hard. And they they didn't keep it a secret from us. Every opportunity they would tell us how hard they worked. Yeah.
And so how big was your family?
Well, it's 5 of us, the immediate family. I've got 2 older sisters, and then my father and my mother.
But I imagine you've got a bit more extended family as well.
Yeah, a huge extended family.
Yeah.
I've got a few uncles, and they have a few kids, and then also my father's uncles as well. So the whole families almost know each other. Anyone with the surname that I have would be related to us, and we would see them more often than not. People are on everyone's business back home, which is a big disadvantage, obviously. But it didn't used to happen a lot in my own family, but I had a lot of friends who were basically mind controlled because of that pressure of family members being on their own business all the time and whatever they did. We faced it a little bit, especially given that my parents are secular in their beliefs, not your traditional Yemeni family. They studied in Russia for almost 13 or 14 years of their lives. That's where they graduated from. Yeah. And so they learned a lot of the communist ideologies and conceptions of being open and moderate, and they came back to the country with that, but they had to moderate it and tame it to fit within the community.
Yeah.
But that didn't prevent them from being different.
That sort of brings us to when your reasons for leaving Yemen. Explain if you can, like what was the circumstances at that time, and what were your options as well in around 2015?
So in 2015, after the Houthis in Yemen took over the capital, a Saudi coalition came into existence amongst many other countries in Gulf and Northern Africa, Sudan, Egypt, Bahrain. A lot of countries were in the coalition. I think around 13 countries decided to basically eliminate that group and take them off the capital, so the official government goes back into the capital to rule. Because basically the Houthis did a coup and took over the capital, and the government had to run into Saudi Arabia and exist from there. And so the ruling official government was ruling from outside the country, and then the Houthis were ruling the northern part of Yemen, and they basically said, this is our country now, we're going to rule it and continue. And that's when the coalition existed and started airstriking the capital, claiming to airstrike facilities that the Houthis used to keep weapons and bombs and missiles or whatever it is. But so many civilians died. The entire infrastructure of the capital was dismantled. There was airstrikes on hospitals, airstrikes on neighborhoods, on malls. The airstrike didn't leave anything, basically. And we lived through it normally, because I remember the exact moment. It was a Thursday morning around 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of airstrikes. And we've heard so many bombs previously from civil wars that used to happen, but that one was quite extraordinary because the whole house was shaking. And for 4 hours, 3 hours, you didn't know what happened until the news channels started to report it at 8 a.m., 7 a.m. And then you went out and you saw the destruction that was happening in so many regions. And I used to live in a house, so behind us used to be one of the biggest military bases in the country, basically.
Yeah, right.
And it used to belong to a general who used to own 50% of the military power of the country. And so we used to live in that neighborhood. And one of their biggest locations to airstrike was that. And there are a few homes that have basically vanished from existence in our neighborhood, but we were super lucky to just get some broken glasses and some damage on the yard and a few of our cars as well from the rocks that were flying around and landing on our yard. But at that time, there were a few options. Do we go to the countryside and wait to see what happens in the capital and who ends up being powerful? But my father is quite seasoned in politics, and he knows quite a lot about the history and what happens. And he knew from the day that this is not a 2-year, 3-year war. This is gonna last for at least 30 years, 20 years. And we can't just leave our houses and go, because they'll basically take it. And it used to happen to so many people. They left to the countryside, came back to people living in their own houses. And so our next option was to leave to Jordan and then leave a few family members in our house. And then our family would send us somewhere else to go and figure out our lives. And they'd go back to our houses and properties and whatever they had. And that was basically the option that they went with. And this is a true story, and it's not probably the only reason why we left Yemen, but it's one of the major reasons that contributed to my father and mother taking us out of the country. Is I used to have horrible teeth in Yemen. I used to have braces, and I used to have this doctor that used to have a clinic in this mall. And this mall was located 200 meters away from the ex-president's house. And this was during 2015. So I grabbed my friend, because I had an appointment with this doctor, and I grabbed my friend so we can go together. We took the bus, stopped the bus, got off the bus, and we can see destruction all over the place where the mall is, just because 2 days ago there was an airstrike on the ex-president's house, and they've completely destroyed the house. So that region was dedicated safe because they've bombed whatever they wanted to bomb. And then as soon as we go into the large stairway that leads into the mall entrance, a big airstrike happens, and the whole ground just shakes, and the whole glass just shatters around us, and we can see it raining rocks. And all of that happens, mind you, in like a span of a fraction of a second. You don't even have time to process any of it. And I was pulling my friend to go into the mall. He was pulling me out of the mall to go and run away from where the airstrike happened. And at the time, I was trying to run away from the rain of rocks. He was trying to run away from the shattered glass of the mall. And he ended up to make the right decision of pulling me outside of the mall and to run away into different neighborhoods. And I remember a very vivid scene where an old lady was carrying a wooden chair, and she has fell on the ground, and her chair was broken, and a bus driver stopped for her, pulled her in, and she was so worried about her chair. She didn't want to leave the chair. And I remember in my mind, it was like, lady, get on the bus, what are you doing? And then we were just sprinting because we were like youthful and we could just run away. But some people couldn't, and so people that, like cars that were passing by, they would crash into each other, they would stop to get someone in or whatever it was. It was a major chaos. But as we were running, my phone had fell, and I picked it up, and I didn't realize that the battery had come off the phone at the time, but I picked it up and started running again, and then another airstrike happened within the same few minutes, but we continued on running. And then I picked up my phone, and I could see that the battery was out. So I put the battery back on the phone, tried to switch it on. It didn't. Why this is relevant is because my family was trying to call me at the time because they've known that an airstrike has happened at that scene. Anyway, I can't remember exactly how we went out of it, but we reached this neighborhood, and we were sitting just under a tree laughing. Me and my friend was like, oh, this was crazy. What has happened? And then we just grabbed a taxi, went back home. And I think that's the moment my parents felt like, yeah, he could have been dead. That could have been the moment where he could have been dead. And because they were calling and stressing out, they thought that probably something bad has happened. But because I got home super quick, they didn't have a lot of time to process that, oh, our kid is dead. And so that was one of the major contributors to my father specifically, because he's told me, yeah, that was a moment he realized that I had to flee the country. This is no country for a kid of 12 or 15 years old to grow up in. They need a better life. We had a better life. We had the opportunity to study in Russia. Why wouldn't we give them that opportunity? Although it did mean that they would sacrifice watching their kids grow up and having that sense of family, especially at a big age, at an old age. Like, I think about myself at 65 or 70, surrounded by kids, surrounded by my whole family, but they had to do that sacrifice, to make that sacrifice for us to have a better life. So I graduated high school from Jordan and then went to Malaysia with my sisters to help them settle, and then also myself look for my options outside Malaysia because Malaysia wasn't a permanent option.
Yeah.
And so my options were Canada, Australia, and the UK. But the UK option was very tough because their migration policies were quite tough, super tough. And so my pathway to get a passport was very limited. So the other two options I had was Canada and Australia, and I applied for universities. In Australia, I applied for Wollongong, UTAS, National University, and UTAS was the first to reply. But also in Canada, I applied to a few universities, but they never replied. And so once UTAS replied to me, the decision was made that I'm going to Australia. And I had a family member who used to live here as well.
Okay.
And he arrived a year before me, and he told me that it's a good place. It's cheap, and the pathway to a passport is achievable. And that's why I picked Australia.
So you knew a little bit about Tasmania before you came here?
Very little.
Yeah.
And I've probably told you the story on the phone for this podcast, but yeah, when I told my mom I'll be moving to Tasmania, she told me, you're not going to Tanzania. And I told her, that's not where I'm going.
No,
I'm going to a state in Australia. And she was much more calm. She told me, I didn't run you away from Yemen just to go back to Tanzania. You could have just stayed in Yemen. But yeah, it's my cousin knew about Tasmania. He told me it's a very nice and full of nature place, but also it's very quiet and limited when it comes to communities and whatnot. But I was willing to do that sacrifice for the money.
Do you remember what your early impressions were when you first arrived here?
The big problem is I arrived from Kuala Lumpur, which is a big city. so much happening in a big chaos, and I used to go to the city a lot. And so as soon as I arrived, I didn't arrive to Melbourne or Sydney or anywhere. So it was straight from the airport in Melbourne straight to here. And the first thing I saw was just emptiness. There was no one. The airport was even smaller than the one we had in Yemen. And I was like, I could live with this. This is a very nice place. It looks very pretty. We crossed over the Tasman Bridge and looked at the water. It was super nice. And then I started living in the accommodation at university and started to meet with other people. And my first impression was that this is a very hidden place full of lovely people, but there aren't many of them. So I had to go out of my way to try and find friendships. And I wasn't used to Western people in a way, although I had a few friends in Malaysia from different countries. It was quite some time before I adapted to the Western culture.
So what did you do to sort of build those friendships?
Well, the best thing that I always talk to friends of mine that play soccer, it's a blessing that you play soccer and you're good at it, because it opens up so much opportunities for you.
Absolutely.
And so soccer and futsal were my biggest go-to of making friendships, and that's basically where I did most of my friendships. But then also from university, just going into activities, volunteering. I volunteered with UTAS, volunteered with Amnesty. As much as you put yourself out there in activities, but specifically entertaining activities like soccer or basketball, whatever it is you're doing, you're gonna make so many friendships in there if you put the effort. And that's how I broke into it. And you'll see that most of the people that play it, none of them are necessarily seeking to be professional.
Yep.
They know it's almost impossible, but it just gives you so much. And exactly what you said, I know that Hobart United, I was just astonished. I went there to train for a few times just because I had friends who play there. They told me to go train. And I went and trained and looked at the community, and I was fascinated. I was startled by how much impact they had on the people that came that couldn't speak English, that had very low self-esteem, but because of being able to play football and the recognition they got and the activities that that club provided for them, it changed their whole personality. And now they're the big personalities that have learned English, and now they have flourished into this very confident people. And they do so much.
What did you come here to study?
So I applied for a bachelor's of psychology in law, and I got the approval from the University of Tasmania to study that when I was in Malaysia. But then I talked to a few people, and they told me that's one of the worst decisions you can make. Because it's I wasn't necessarily passionate about either psychology or law. It just sounded fancy.
Yep.
And they told me if you're not passionate about it, it's gonna be super tough.
Yep.
As a double degree. And so I decided to just go, if I'm not passionate about anything necessarily, I'll just do business, because it's an overarching kind of course that will open opportunities for me. And I applied for business and finance and economics. So it's a bachelor's of business majoring in finance and economics, basically. And that's what I studied in Tasmania. And to be honest, in hindsight, it was the right choice, because it kind of opened my career paths in so many ways. I wasn't necessarily a master of a specific thing, like I didn't study mathematics or science. I didn't have my niche, but I had so much opportunities other than that, to be policy analyst, policy officer, an accountant, whatever it is, a banker. You basically had all these jobs to apply for. And since I wasn't necessarily passionate about a specific thing, that was the right choice to do.
But as you got close to graduating, did you have a plan or a concept of what you were going to do next?
So I was 18 when I arrived here. And at 18, I knew nothing. I didn't have any passion per se. I just knew that I wanted to do something different, and I didn't want to go the traditional way of studying uni, getting a job, and just continuing that way. But I thought always my family's advice was you should always have a plan B. And my plan B was to get a university degree just to fall on and then do all my other creative stuff on the side. And last year of uni, I still had no idea after I graduate what exactly am I going to do. But I did a few internships. I did an internship with Greening Australia. That was very beneficial for me because I got to know how offices actually work and how people do projects and analyze economic models and whatever it is. And then I volunteered with Amnesty Australia just because I was very passionate about human rights and youth activism. And that kind of shaped my mindset into, okay, I don't want to be working on something robotic, like putting numbers in a sheet or whatever it is. If I'm gonna do this and it's plan B, I better make it enjoyable. And I wanted to work on policy because it meant that I'll be meeting with different stakeholders. I'll be discussing different policies, different issues, and then putting them into a document and then submit it somewhere. That was my whole idea of what policy was. And it's very close. It was very close to what policy actually is. But there's also other aspects to what policy is. And that's basically all the jobs I applied for. And a horrible thing that happened is that I graduated during COVID. So I graduated in 2019. And that was almost impossible to get a job anyway because all the workplaces were closed to hiring anyone because no one knew what was happening in the world. There was so much uncertainty. And I didn't have a permanent residency, so I needed someone nice to accept me for being a temporary resident. But yeah, our RACT was the first company that gave me the opportunity after 2 years of drought. And then I started policy in RACT.
And like, what did you learn from that experience? And considering what you'd learned at during your degree, did you feel like you were prepared, I suppose, for that?
Absolutely not. And to be honest, this is worth me shouting out one of the best people I've ever met in Tasmania. He's my mentor, and he is a person that I respect dearly. And he used to be the one that hired me in RACT, basically. He used to be the chief advocacy officer in RACT. His name is Gary Bailey. And he's such a beautiful human being. And when I applied for the job in RACT, got the interview, and they were very interested in my internship that I did with Greening Australia, just because I worked with economic models. And there was a little bit of policy there as well. And I got the interview, but when I got the interview, Gary Bailey didn't necessarily mind my lack of experience in policy itself, but he saw lots of potential for me as a human being, as someone who wants to put the effort, as someone who's fast learning. And we had this discussion during the interview of very technical stuff regarding policy and finance, and he saw that I had the capabilities of learning and developing within a few months and getting the job right. But then the rest of the interview was basically my story and why do I want to do what I want to do. And he basically changed my life, and he was the pivotal moment of me being where I am today because he had to fight for me to get employed in such a huge company. And they were looking for someone who had the experience to start working and do everything immediately. But Gary Bailey saw past that. And so what I learned is that even if you didn't have the capabilities and skills, putting yourself out there and working on your own storyline could compensate for that. And I hope that I made him proud during my time in RACT, because it was a big gamble for them and it was a big gamble for him, but he fought for it. And I learned so much from that experience. And it's basically what landed me the job now in the department in the government that I work in. And to be even more radical, I would say I've seen people with no degrees that are getting jobs better than mine just because they had better experience. And that's something I always struggle to to make my family comprehend, especially my parents, coming from that previous age of certificates and credentials of getting a job, specifically in their own industries of being doctors. You have to have that. You can't be a doctor out of
Yep.
everything else you do outside medicine. It doesn't work that way. And so when they now try to pressure me, you have to do your master's now and then PhD, and I'm like, I had managers in my experience that dropped out of high school. There is no need for any of that unless you had a passion for the exact thing you're studying, and then trying to implement it into the workplace that you're working on. Other than that, you have no reason of taking all of these credentials without having the experience. For example, when I went to Greening Australia, Amnesty, and then volunteering with UTAS as well, I met so many different people, and some of them are still my references today that gave me the jobs that I got. And so it's the reason for having a good experience, giving you the ability to get previous jobs or previous opportunities, is because of the people and the networks that you build through that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's even more important in a place like Tasmania, where
It's all about networks.
it is.
And in my case, it was, we want a fresh eye. We want someone who has the foundation, but doesn't know all the rigid kind of ways that we've been doing it forever. We want someone with a fresh eye who could be creative in the ways we do things moving forward. So there's that opportunity as well. But without the experience of the networks you've created, it doesn't matter how creative or different you are, because it's almost like filters you go through. First filter, does this person have foundations? Do they have the capability and the skills to be put in a place to learn? The second filter is, are they creative? Do they take initiative? And then the final filter is, how are they dealing with other people they work with? Are they good team players? Are they very tough to work with? And then that's basically how you get a job. And once you simplify it in that way and start tackling each of these elements before you graduate uni, by the time you graduate, you'll have all the skills you need to get employed, if that's what you're seeking.
How did your current job at the Department of Premier and Cabinet, how did that come about?
I started to get to a time in RST where it was probably best for me to be put in a more challenging environment so I could learn more and also feed my arsenal in many different ways. And again, going back to having mentors as well, my mentor told me that a government experience would be really good for understanding the other aspects of things, because working in private, I used to always nag the government to pay for stuff. Now I get nagged.
Yeah.
So I'm on the other side of the coin now, and that's such an extraordinary experience to get. And so when I applied for this job and they accepted, I was quite happy, because it gave me the opportunity to now work with the government and see how the government engine works, how the government machine actually operates.
And how many years have you been doing that now?
6 months now.
Apart from soccer, you mentioned to me you're into a bit of music as well.
Yes, I'm very much into music and writing. I've written a novel that I haven't published because I still want to do further edits on, but I've finalized it. I've done 6 drafts and, the big hustle of writing a novel. I wrote it during COVID just because I had nothing else to do.
Okay.
And then I started discovering my writing skills. I started journaling a little bit, and then from that I always had a fictional mindset of, all right, let's say I'm sitting in a room. I'd have all of these fictional scenarios happening in my head. And so I started putting that into paper, and then I started creating a story somehow, and then that story developed into a timeline that I was very invested in and I was dreaming about and I was thinking about all night, and then I put it into a novel. And then I discovered that, I like to write, and here I am, I've just finished a novel. I've always loved music, and people who know me, who really know me, they know that I've always loved to sing. I've always loved to create music and to listen to music. And every now and then I'd put something on a software, like a beat or a few drums, but it was never serious until a year and a half ago, where I purchased a a software, and then because I made the commitment of putting $350 into buying this software, I had to put something in it, and that forced me into discovering myself as a musician.
Okay.
And ever since I've been just producing music, learning so much about mixing and mastering and singing, and yeah, I've been loving it.
I think it's really important to have those other things outside, especially creative things outside your work, and that just for your mental health, if nothing else.
Absolutely. And I come from a very creative family.
Okay.
My grandfather is a novelist. My uncle is a writer and a literature genius. My father is one of the best poets, in my opinion.
Right.
I'm very biased because he is my father.
Yeah.
But he is an incredible poet, an incredible writer, and a political analyst. And he's very creative. But no one from my family has ever tapped into music before.
Okay.
So I'm the first to discover that sector and see if we're also creative in that side.
Because I was going to ask you whether that creativity was encouraged in your family or in your in the community around you.
Yeah, when it comes to writing, for sure. Music is a very foreign concept.
Okay.
And so I don't necessarily discuss music very much with my family. And I think they would love it to stay that way.
Yeah.
Like, do you, but I don't think they would be very supportive about my music career, although it's now more serious than my writing career because I love it more. But there's a big element of writing into music as well. When you write the lyrics, it stems from a story, from characters as well. But when it comes to writing, they've always encouraged me to be a good writer, to write poems. I used to write poems when I was like 8 years old, 9 years old,
right.
and my father and mum would be fighting with all their friends so they could put it on a magazine or something to encourage me. And we got super close one day, but then I think my father's friend bailed on us and we didn't really follow it up. But yeah, they've always encouraged me to write poems, and they knew I had a sense of writing, I had a sense of story. And they always loved that about me and encouraged me to do it, for sure. And because my mum's uncle as well is a great writer, and so she always tells me, you can be like him, you can be like him. And you know how parents always try to imagine themselves in you in a way, and they don't necessarily imagine themselves as musicians, but they imagine themselves as writers, as people who started from a very young age, and that's why they encourage me in that way.
So was it mainly your family that influenced you to write, or were there some things you'd read that inspired you or inspired your style even?
Well, I grew up in a house full of books. There is no one corner in our house without a big shelf full of books. Even my father and mother, they brought a big bookshelf that's almost the entire wall, and they brought it from Russia with them instead of just buying one, just because it was very meaningful for them, and it's so full of books. So everywhere I went, I would see books and I would see writing and it subconsciously would make me write sometimes. And I remember the first instance I ever wrote anything, and it was a very dark night because the electricity was off. As you know, in certain regions of the Arab world and poor countries and third world countries, electricity is not a 24 hours thing. Yeah. It comes and goes. And I remember there was a candle, and I was just writing. I was just feeling emotional as a 8 years old who's probably never had any experiences on their lives, and just feeling like I'm the biggest poet, and I'm feeling emotional. And I wrote this horrible poem, and then my parents came back from work at that night, and they read it, and they were just stunned. They probably exaggerated in the way they should have reacted just because they wanted to encourage me. But my mom until today tells me that it's so beautiful, like whatever you wrote was so good. And that was the first time I ever wrote something. And because I saw the reaction on their faces, and I got that sense of, I got some confidence that, oh, I'm good at something. And so I started doing it more, and I started writing stuff. But I never went anywhere really until I came to Australia and wrote this novel. And then I told my family about the story, and they just loved it.
much, I guess, contact do you still have with family? I understand your family's sort of a little bit spread now.
Yep, I'm in contact with all my immediate family almost daily. In fact, sometimes I call them and they don't answer. But yeah, that's a problem for another day, and I've been scolding them on it. But my immediate family, yeah, I'm very well connected to all of them. My extended family, part of them, I still touch base every now and then, but part of them I've lost connection completely. But it's mostly the people that I wouldn't even contact if I were in Yemen anyway.
Okay, yeah.
But the people that I used to contact and see almost daily in Yemen, I'm still in contact with, and I still check upon. Maybe not as frequent as my immediate family, but I still make sure I do. And I always want to stay connected to my roots and the family.
And what do they tell you about the situation in Yemen?
It's very negative, although my family is very optimistic.
Okay.
And a very positive family, and they come with a mindset of no matter what it is, you have to adapt. But even so, they've been telling me that poverty has risen, and as a result, the morale and how people behave has completely changed. People are not as pure, they're not as generous, not as hospitable, and on a daily basis, I worry that at any given moment, my parents could die. At any given moment. And that's a fact. That's a given. And it has happened to so many people I know. Especially given the uncertainty that's happening in the world now. It's very easy to be worried, to put it slightly. The other thing that's probably problematic in a way is that although we are worried, but probably I'm not the only person that feels this way, but we are a little numb to it in a way. Like, if I were to lose a family member to an airstrike, I would be sad, but at the same time, I'd be numb to it in a way because it was expected. I grew up facing it. I saw so many airstrikes with my bare eye. Like, you become quite numb to it. And so when I speak to people from different cultures, I could see the shock in their eyes, but for me, it's almost like I'm talking about a normal day. It's nothing dramatic. And that's genuinely how we feel. It's nothing dramatic. But once you live somewhere else, you start realizing how dramatic it actually is.
And as I understand, historically in Yemen, there's a lot of different tribes, and there's a bit of a tribal element to the
Absolutely.
culture.
Yeah, there's definitely a tribal element. And a big thing, for example, is everyone in Yemen could name every single member of their family on their chain of names until they get to the surname. Yeah, so they could name to you around 30 names, beginning with themselves, their father, grandfather, great-grandfather, until they reach the surname. And by doing so, you understand where do you meet with other tribes? Because your surname could be the cousin of another tribe who have a different surname, but if you go higher up also, you'll know where you meet. And some people go up all the way to Prophet Noah. And the parts of people that live in Yemen who are related to the Prophet Muhammad, for example, they could track themselves all the way back to Prophet Muhammad by name.
So your family tree is quite important then.
100%. And your family would make sure you know all the names. I might have forgotten a few, but I probably could name 10. I couldn't name all of them. But I'd get quite far. My own tribe is known for being creative and being writers and being revolutionary and against the hierarchy and whatnot. That's what my family is known about. But then you get another family who are known for their ancestry to Prophet Muhammad. And so that's how they act, that's how they behave. They come from that more superior pedestal in a way.
Yeah, okay. So it sort of informs their identity.
Exactly. Yeah. It does. And it forms the entire community's identity because, for example, there are there are tribes in Yemen who wouldn't marry from other tribes.
Yeah.
And it's segregated in that way. There's lots of racism that goes around as well. Okay. It's much more less now.
So racism in what way? Like against
color.
Okay, so people from like African
Yeah,
countries?
well, yeah, 100%. Because we have a lot of immigrants in the southern part of Yemen from Ethiopia, from Somal, from Sudan. Yeah, even the slurs you use on these people are normal for people who live in Yemen, but are not normal for people who are educated and outside Yemen. So inside Yemen, you have a lot of educated people that do not use these slurs, do not behave with those people in any different way that they would behave with anyone else. But you have a lot of other people, and I say a lot, that yeah, based on your color, they would deal with you differently. And there are so many tribes that wouldn't marry, for example, a darker skinned person just because it might play with their skin tone and
So they want to keep it sort of pure, their
yeah,
family line pure or something.
yeah, exactly. I'm very proud to be Yemeni. I'll always be, but I'm also very proud that this country has made me part of it as well. And so part of me now will forever be Australian. And I love to express that in whatever I do.